Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hello?
Does that work?
Yes.
Yes.
What?
Yep.
Nope.
I'm gonna dance now. A little, yeah. Don't sing the Jeopardy theme song. I actually worked with Ken Jennings for 15 years.
Was it
Yeah.
bad?
Yeah. But I'm not going to be talking about my game show exploits. I work as a software engineer, and I have also been working for the last 7 years in theoretical economic research. Perfect combination of the two in this presentation, the fallacy of bifurcation with examples from computer science and economics. Oh, wait, does that work? Yes, the fallacy of bifurcation. Wikipedia quotes it as saying all but two options are excluded. The idea behind it is that sometimes, and there's certain circumstances where you have choices, or sometimes, at least thought to be locked into just two choices. And that's sometimes not true. It might be a third, or a fourth, or a fifth, or more. This fallacy is also known by other various names. For example, the subset, it's a subset of a false dilemma name for that. It's also known as a false dichotomy, a false binary, but basically erroneously limits the available options that are there when you have some choices. And we're going to be talking about this in terms of two examples. One being that of computer programming memory management. In the early 1970s, when you were writing a computer program, you basically, when it came to memory management, basically making sure that a computer program that you wrote had enough memory to do what you wanted, the approach that you did then and up until the mid-1990s was to do it yourself. The canonical example about that was the C programming language developed out of Bell Labs, Dennis Kerrigan, roughly 1972. And you handled all the memory yourself. In fact, you couldn't even program without explicitly saying what memory assignments that you made when writing a program. There were some problems with this approach. Among the most prominent about them was that it was very difficult to debug. If you had a problem, God help you, because the stack trace that you got as a result of that made it extremely difficult to try to tease your way to trying to find out what exactly went wrong. And to an extent that you would not know where you actually stood on the score, and you actually forgot what you were actually supposed to be programmed. And that makes it annoying. So the other thing was annoying. That basically stood up until 1995, when a new approach, generally referred to as garbage collection. That's the actual technical term. The idea would be that the computer would basically store any excess memory, track it for you, and remove it if unneeded. So that in effect, you basically did none of it yourself. And the canonical example about this, courtesy of Sun Microsystems in 1995, with an epic marketing campaign, resulted in the programming language known as Java. And this was basically the paradigm. Most computer programming languages still use this approach, but this is also beset with problems. Because it handles all of that, it can be very slow. It can also, and Java is very notorious for this, it can be very bloated. It takes a lot of code to do something, and that's not very efficient. Because of that, as well as the speed and the handling that was required, it was not very efficient as a result. Not great, but these were basically most of the choices that you had. The fallacy of bifurcation. You either did all of it yourself, or until you did none of it yourself. Until about 2009, when a computer programmer worked for Mozilla by the name of Graydon Holare, living in Vancouver, worked for Mozilla, and he said, well, maybe there's another way of doing this. You could do it yourself, but with modern tooling and different approaches for handling that memory. And he actually involved this with a computer programming language that has been catching on for doing a lot of low-level memory management, known as Rust. And this is increasingly used in industry, increasingly used in computer science and computer work. Don't be surprised if a lot of the apps that you use increasingly are using Rust under the hood. When you actually survey computer programmers as far as they ask what the biggest problem with Rust is, in their opinion, the biggest problem that they have is that it's kind of hard to learn. I'm reading the Rust programming book, the canonical example about Rust, I don't think it's that hard, but that's just me. But anyway, this is the biggest complaint. So that's your fallacy of bifurcation, where you thought that you either had to do all of management yourself or none of it yourself, but there were other approaches for doing that. The second example about this is in economic allocation systems. This could be a little controversial. The biggest approach about this, the one we still have today, is that of an allocation system handling markets. Sellers and buyers who interact in a market using competitive prices that reflect bargaining power. The canonical example about this, you're all too familiar with capitalism, which you might have some passing familiarity with. And there's also might have some passing familiarity with some of its problems. Antagonistic roles where buyers and sellers compete against each other, not to mention competitors within the market. Externalities, which is a fancy way of just the unanticipated effects of a market exchange. Like, for example, if you're buying a car and you're burning gasoline, and the effects of that kind of cause global warming to go haywire, and the planet gets too hot to live, that's an externality. Because too many people are fighting against each other within this economic realm, the result is you're not actually doing the economic activity that you need to do in the economy to produce, consume, and allocate. That makes things very inefficient. And this was one approach. A second approach that folks know about by part of the 20th century is that of command planning, where you have a single authority that basically calculated the economy and gave orders to everyone else to basically produce and consume everything that they needed. The canonical example about this, within the Warsaw Pact, the communist economies of the mid-20th century. This, of course, was beset with problems of their own. It was extremely dictatorial because your choice was either give orders or take orders. There was no in between. Sometimes there'd be, in order to make sure that people kept to this, there was systems about this were beset with violence. So it was extremely violent. And because you're not doing the economic activity on this score, it can be very inefficient as far as the economy is concerned. So there's a degree of inefficiency there. And this is your bifurcation. It's either one or the other. In fact, a famous economist by the name of Alec Nove famously remarked in 1983, there is no third way until there was. In the early 1990s, economists have actually been starting to organize a third way of approaching this called democratic planning. The idea is that producers and consumers democratically figure out an economic plan for themselves. The canonical example about this, in 1991, Michael Albert and Robin Hanel co-wrote 2 books where they outlined an economy that has since become known as the model of a participatory economy. A lot to talk about with this. The short answer is that people organize themselves into workplaces or neighborhoods and arrive at a proposed plans for either producing or consuming things and work together to arrive at a society-wide economic plan. There's actually a new network that has actually just formed last month called INDEP, the International Network for Democratic Economic Planning. You can look that up if you're interested. The biggest problem about this is that it doesn't exist yet. So maybe someday it will. That concludes my presentation.
Questions?
Like Patricia Andrzejewski said, hit me with a best shot. That's, by the way, Pat Benatar's original maiden name, Andrzejewski. Yes?
I don't know a lot about economics, so I'm sorry if this is a weird question. Where does, socialism fall in all of that?
Yeah, where does socialism fall into this? And short answer is it's considered to be a synonym for communism. It's also a command planning economy, and it's the same idea. People are either giving orders or taking orders, and that's basically the only alternative that there is in that economy. So it's considered a synonym of communism, command planning.
Depends on the version of socialism.
What?
Depends on the version of socialism. There's a lot of them.
Other questions?
Yeah,
Question.
Yeah. How does a language that's built off of
talking about the computer science stuff like Python
Yeah.
fit into the memory allocation? Because as far as I remember programming with Python, you don't have to do that memory
That's
allocation.
correct, yeah.
But at the same time, it avoids the bloated issues.
Yes and no. We're actually talking about a different computer programming language, Python, which it turns out is built on top of C. Python ranks among the top 5 most used programming languages in the world. And it basically, it sidesteps the bloat basically by not going up to scale. Most people who use Python tend to use it for fairly small-ish things. But I mean, small means like under 1 million. But it basically sidesteps that issue. If you're to scale to larger issues, billions, trillions, which happens sometimes. I've sometimes dealt with that myself. You still have problems, and you still got to be handling that in a more efficient manner, which it kind of just sidesteps. Other
Thank you
questions?
so much.